So I have the great honor to introduce our first speaker today. His name is José González, and so you've seen all of the information here, but I'm going to take a moment just to read it out loud with you. So José González is the founder of Latino Outdoors and co-founder of the Outdoors Oath. He's a professional educator with training in the fields of education and conservation while engaging in different artistic endeavors with art and messaging, often exploring the intersection of the environment and culture. As a partner in the Urbana Group and through his own consulting, his work focuses on equity and inclusion frameworks and practices in the environmental, outdoor, and conservation fields. He is also an illustrator and science communicator. He received his BA at the University of California, Davis, and his MS at the University of Michigan School of Natural Resources and Environment. His teaching coursework was at the Bilingual Multicultural Education Department at Sacramento State. He serves as a trustee for the National Outdoor Leadership School, a trustee for the National Recreation Foundation, and Outdoor Industry Association Board of Directors, among other such leadership volunteer roles. So I'm so excited to hear you talk today, and please help me in welcoming him.
Hit the PowerPoint.
Yeah.
That one, and then do share screen, or is that good to go?
Yeah, let's share screen.
Okay.
And get your PowerPoint.
Well, as that's getting set up, I have a couple of slides for you. And I want to acknowledge and recognize we don't have a lot of time. So like 20 minutes is a little constraining in terms of a lot we can talk about. So I'm going to offer a little bit about how I approach the work, from which there could be a lot from me there. So first, again, José González, or José Guadalupe Adonis González Rosales de León, full name. I did not know that as a kid, as an immigrant from Mexico, that was going to be one of my first cues that later on as an adult, example of when I talk about what I mean by social cultural spaces, I kind of begin to define you or begin to send cues as to like how you can show up and not. I wasn't even Jose until coming to the US. Actually, I was Lupe. There we go. He and his will respond to anything offered with joy and respect. I am just across the causeway at the moment. So an ancestral traditional stone occupied, unceded and ancestral traditional lands of Nitan, to the Maidu, Miwok, so many others that I think you're familiar with. And then lastly, as I go through all of this, there's the handle if you want to tweet or tag anything. I consent. As I say, I'll go quick, but then there'll be a couple of minutes for Q&A. And what I want to invite everyone is, as we said, kind of like assess that we're always at our learning edge, which is a space of growth, just beyond our comfort. Comfort is amazing, but as you all know, it doesn't provide that cognitive struggle that allows us to learn and be like, oh, that's interesting. As well as I'm not asking you, nor am I dragging you into an alarm zone, for which, of course, no learning will also happen. And this is a little bit of sharing kind of my own learning journey. This is kind of my Michael Pollan attempt at putting that sentence from which then I can sprout a lot of other things. Be with nature as nature in radical and revolutionary balance. So it's a reminder to take the time to actually be out there, right? There's so many benefits to being out in nature. You've heard this reminder, and for many of you familiar, you'll continue to hear this reminder that we are a part of nature. And the more that we lean into being a part rather than a part, is part of this work. And the revolutionary and radical balance for me, it's kind of this notion of how we can be disruptive in a good way. And by radical, I'm really looking at kind of the root word of the word radical, which is kind of that root, raíz. And so I think about, well, how can I be radical, not as on the outside, as seen kind of out there as an extremist, but being rooted here, support for the work that we do. And so thinking radical not as from outside in, but radical from being right here. And then being revolutionary in the sense of not just disruptive for the sake of being disruptive, or that you're seen as someone like an agent that isn't wanted, but rather revolutionary, looking at the word, again, the kind of root of that word, revolution, cycles. What does revolutionary mean to me as being part of a regenerative cycle, of being an agent in supporting and creating regenerative cycles, which is what you do in all the restoration work that you do. Because it's when we disrupt those cycles, it's when we mess them up, it's when we perpetuate destructive cycles. It's mostly kind of all of our conservation environmental messes that we're in. Climate change kind of being one of the clearest examples as we disrupted the carbon cycle. Oh, I see. Perfect. Not like a bird, though. And so I say this because as we, all good? Yeah. As we lean into this work, is beginning to look, kind of begin to poke a little bit at some of the presumptions, some of the things that we start off with in ways, go one back, please, in ways that when we talk about things like traditional ecological knowledge, other ways of knowing, other ways of being reconnected to, for example, native science, indigenous connections to a landscape. So just ignore the fact that the slides are going, it's okay. As we're doing this is not to kind of fall into that trap where people often say, oh, well, then you're against quote unquote Western science, or that they are necessarily in conflict with each other. It acknowledges really what is the default, what is the starting point, and for which we can be complementary and expansive from, and not reductive in a way that's limiting to think there's only one way to engage with the ecological system, and what do we need? And for me, it's an exciting invitation to really need and understand these different ways of engaging that we adapted with, that we had for a long time. And that if we don't really find a way to connect with them, we end up in some of the messes that we are now. And so that's why I like to share this one. This is the National Science Foundation project from a couple of years ago, the Cosmic Serpent. In which you kind of had some quote unquote traditional scientists work with a different variety of native elders and scientists to really look at how could these work together? How can they coexist? How can they provide different ways of knowing and learning? Which in the report that they submitted is an invitation in itself. Here's how I can read the report in kind of this linear fashion that maybe I'm used to. And here's how you can read the report in this circular fashion that you might not be used to, but the Native community is. And as I'm going through this and I think about the work that I try to do is aligned for systemic change. And systemic change, really thinking of kind of our human spaces. The nature space has its own systems that I know many of you are familiar with. But what I want to be a part of this is to really to think about what is the future of our human relationships that I want that can be very different, that can be nurturing, that can be thriving, because we've inherited a lot of what we often say are oppressive systems, things that we're trying to undo and redo. And so as I approach this work, this is from FSG Water Systems Change, really being able to look at what are some of the structural elements that are very explicit. We kind of know if they're there or not. Do you have a policy? Is it resource? Is it in the budget, for example? What about relational, semi-explicit? We know it's there, but it takes a little bit of work to kind of unpack it out. So when you say, well, there's power dynamics in the space. What does that mean? If I were to sit down and draw it out, what does that look like? What do I mean in terms of power? How does that show up in terms of a title versus a structural privilege? All of those different elements. Down to the mental models. I think of it as a conceptual change because I like the rhyming. But the mental models are really the mind shift. Is our cognitive maps, the way that we make meaning of the world and says, this is what I use to make sense. That often, for example, in
Science conceptual work is what we try to unpack and really be able to correct if necessary. And so that can be really challenging because we like to hold on very tightly to those. And they don't change by just being told that you're wrong. Right? It's a whole process. Many of you are familiar with this. And yet we need all of these different elements because if we only focus on structural and don't engage mental models, those can show up to inhibit the work. And if we only work on mental model work, we can't be surprised if we don't have the structural and relational element to also be able to move it. So I'll be talking a little bit about most of these, but really kind of leaning into that mental model. And then the last two pieces here is part of why I engage in this work is, I said, we're dealing with kind of the demographic, the reality of the demographic inevitability that, for example, this country, this state, it's already there, it's going to look very different in 2050 than in 1950. And that can be great and exciting, not something to be afraid of or terrified or think that, oh no, we need to go back. And I know it's easy to say that. And we're in the middle of really kind of wrestling with that. And I often like to think about the simple reminder that the work that you do, you know the benefits of biodiversity. You know what it brings to a space. I think very few, maybe if none of you go out there and say, that's a beautiful monocultural forest, right? Let's work to do that. Let's actively just keep a monoculture because you know the dangers to an ecosystem when that is present. And so for me, it's leaning into that, knowing that this also affects not just the representation, the diversity of people, but how those shows up in the decision-making spaces, in places of power. Who gets elected, who sits on a board, who leads an organization. And so that's part of when we think about not just the diversity, but as we're leaning into the equity and inclusion and justice-oriented work. Or as I'm working on a different type of DEIJ as well. But I'll get to that, what my shirt represents. And we're doing this in ways that we know it's not just the easy work. It's not just about working with intentional users, early adopters, people that maybe already like to hike, like the outdoors, like to do field work. It's understanding, this is from Charles Thomas, who's the executive director of Outward Bound Adventures, which is different than Outward Bound. Being able to say, there are intentional non-users, and rather than just accepting that, oh, they might not be interested, is acknowledging that it could be real deep work as to why they might say, nah, I'm good, not for me. And if you only say, oh, I guess they're not interested, you might miss the point that there are historical reasons. There is generational information that has been passed on as to why you don't want to go out into the woods. You don't want to be alone doing field work. And so some of the work that I do often is kind of when we say the outdoors, which has this relationship to nature, to conservation, to environmental work. For me, I look at them as different facets of being in relationship with the land. But I share this because I want to kind of present an example of what do I mean about poking a little deeper. This is some of the tracking from the Outdoor Foundation, just kind of participation in outdoor activities. So you could look at something like this and be like, well, there it is. We can see different trend lines. We can see the self-reported here Black demographic being low. And then we might get something like this from the 2017 Nature of American Studies. You get asked the question, how would you rate your interest in the following activities? So how would you rate your interest in hiking? And so when people respond to this, with that question, one of the takeaways that they put out there was interest in hiking low, you can't see it here, but among Black adults, because that's 19% in a lot. And yet if we ask not interest in hiking, but interest in walking outdoors, they all shoot up. So what is different between hiking and walking outdoors? Right? It's rhetorical and not. When you're really saying what is different, your physical body, you're still asking it to do the same. I'm not saying, hiking, you have to be doing it at 20 miles an hour, and walking is not. You could both be moving your body at the same pace. in the same terrain. But culturally, in terms of that social construct, what are we communicating that for somebody be like hiking, I'm stoked, I'm ready. And for somebody like hiking, yeah, nah, that's not for me. Those are the little interrogations that for me, I don't just apply to something like hiking, but a lot of the terms and concepts that are present in the work that we do in our professions. And it doesn't for me mean, oh no, hiking is bad, let's never use it. It's to be able to acknowledge how then can I be present so that it can be as inclusive, it can be as joyful as it might be for me. Going to the second half, being aware of my time. And so this is Dr. Rupert Meyer shared this 2018 Pioneers, I believe. And it was popular because it's a really cool image. We like to talk about the effects of colonization. And she was looking at this not just as like, well, colonization is bad and it's like driving everything. It was really being able to say, you know, I can understand as a doctor, she's a medical physician, and she can say, like, I can understand trauma, like physical trauma. You get a cut, you treat it. You fall, you hit yourself, you can treat it. What about trauma that shows up generationally? What about other trauma that can still show up physically, but it isn't because you cut yourself? It is because there's this ancestral memory of the effects of cultural genocide. It's because of the effects, right, of families passing down to say, hey, don't forget, you can't do this in the same way that others can. And so she showed this in a way that I think about as kind of the system of harms that we've inherited. And the writer, Michelle Holiday, was kind of saying, well, colonization, what is the logic behind colonization? It's really kind of this mechanistic reductionist worldview. It begins to set the logic that I can justify how to other you, and other you as a person and other you as non-human kin. Let me treat the tree just as an object so that I can extract it for its utility. Because for me then, when we flip it to a life logic, to a life honor worldview, as the writer Michelle Holiday was also looking for this is just not just what we're fighting against, but what we're fighting for. And when we flip it, we get to find most, if not all, the words that you're engaging in. Stewardship, regeneration, nature's abundance. This is what I often say is with people like, well, you know, I'm just like my field work. I do stream restoration. I can't, like social justice work I didn't go to school for that. Not really, you know, part of my work. You have the basis for it. The question is, will you engage in it from the expertise that you hold? Because going back to the structural elements, redlining maps are kind of one of our clearest research-based examples that we have when we talk about that it isn't just about personal choices. It isn't just personal interest in decisions. There are structural elements that shape this. And so for redlining map, even though it was in housing, it wasn't, for example, Black families or Black and brown families being able to say, well, I want to live just in this neighborhood. It was, would you be given the loan? Would you receive the document that said, you actually can't buy this house? Would it be influenced by those mental models, those mind maps of the loan officer down to like how the funding was allocated straight up from the federal government through the state right down to your bank? But we've inherited these maps that aren't just limited to housing. We know they affect just about so many other things and everything else, including our connection, you know, the diversity of the nature that we have access to. This is from Science 2020, the ecological and evolutionary consequences of systemic racism in urban environments. In other words, redlining maps affect the kind of nature that you can have access right outside your door. And we have these. And the fact that we have these maps, because there's a bunch of other maps that maybe haven't been archived in the same way, but they could still be there. Right? And the storytelling and the narratives and what gets passed down from communities. And so these are examples of how, we said we are using this to see how they affect so many ways in which we relate to each other and the land. And so this is the example of even kind of seeing how that segregation affects the ecological and evolutionary outcomes. So again, I'm going fast on some of these, but just to kind of give you a snapshot. So I'm closing with, for me, what this has meant in terms of how I approach the work. This image, for California, we know that there's a lot of traumatic relationship to fire. I also look at this and it's kind of like a cry, sad laugh, because it's like, oh, ooh, these are the conditions that we were in, that we created. And we can look at something like this and we know that, as a colleague, Jorge Moreno's executive director at Jasper Ridge in Stanford likes to say, right, it's our past practices compounded by climate change that caught up with us in a place like California, which means that any type of spark in some of these landscapes are intensive destructive wildfires. And we do our best to firefight our way through them, but we know that that's not the only response. So we're reconnecting to that practice of prescribed burning, right? Which is an ancestral practice, which is to be able to look at the history and say, for example, how Native communities engage with it. A lot of the things that I know you're familiar with, the benefits of fire to a fire adaptive ecosystem, but also means you're a responsible fire tender. You're also working with the land so that you're part of that regenerative cycle again. Because it's crucial to healthy succession. Right? And so this, I believe, is not the part that's new to you. For me, I think about, well, what have I inherited? What have we inherited that no longer serves us? What needs to burn? But not just burn us and let's burn it down and throw the match in fire and not be surprised that maybe there are those past practices compounded by a different type of climate change, where then we burn it all down. Is what does it mean to be a responsible fire tender? And what prescribed burning do we need in our social, relational, social, emotional, social, cultural spaces? What is that underbrush? Because if we continue to suppress it, it's like, yeah, we shouldn't talk about racism. We shouldn't engage in that tension and conflict. And we're creating those conditions where then a little spark afterwards blows up and like, where'd that come from? This is what I mean about engaging into that growth-oriented discomfort, that burning, that slow, tense burning, so that we can have a space for healthy succession and continue to have regenerative cycles around this work. And again, this doesn't mean that everything that's mechanical is bad. I mean, here I am using my phone. It's about saying, I don't want that to be the only way or the default by which I engage and assess everything. And even just as Dr. Robin Wall Kilmer shares in her book and some writers, right? Like, let me investigate the language. And so the times that you hear your team is functioning like a well-oiled machine, it's meant with good intention. You're doing great, be efficient, you're doing amazing, keep it up. But what if I come to you and say, hey, your team is functioning like a well-nurtured meadow or like a thriving meadow? It may sound weird and odd, right? But I can still ask you to interrogate, well, what does that mean then in terms of the leadership that we're valuing, the relationships, the outputs? Because I imagine, again, few or none of you are going to go to a meadow and be like, come on, meadow better, right? You are not meadowing enough. But especially those of you that are out there in the field, it takes that work to create those conditions for survivability. You're not going out there and every day and be like, yeah, man, you need to grow another 10 inches today, right? I need you to hurry up because I need to put it in my report. So to close, I say this, trust me, and that's a whole world of philanthropy right there, I know, for your grant reporting and all of that. I say this is from the Lawrence Hall of Science, their work around reflecting on practice. And so sometimes it can start by really like looking at this because, yeah, I'm afraid of fire. And yet I know that if I'm afraid of it and try to control and dominate in ways like, nah, I may be removing myself from being that revolutionary radical that is necessary to create thriving ecosystems rather than perpetuate those harmful ones. So I can begin with some of this work, some of this interrogation. You know, why does this unsettle me? How does this lens change my understanding? And then I can insert whatever that work that I'm doing. How does this lens change my understanding of race dynamics of this community and beyond, of gender dynamics, of ableism, right, of sexism, of the isms, which are the ideologies of oppressions, which are social constructs that we can change. So pause here because we want to have a bit of time for Q&A. And also know that this is just a point of engagement for me. It leads up to many other different ways in how I might practice river knowing and river being in engaging in this difference, and the way that I talk about seeding, rooting, blooming, and fruiting as practices of growth and even impact reporting for grants. So it's the way that I connect the language of ecology to be in service of social justice, because again, of how we can, and I don't say this in simplistic ways of like, oh, I'm romanticizing or glamorizing nature, is the human element is pretty impactful and special. And the more that we perpetuate that separation, the more that we may be doing a disservice from some of the work that we are rooted in. With that, gracias.